Have you ever felt yourself fading, like a once vibrant painting slowly losing its color? The mornings grow heavier, the days blend together, and that flame within, the one that once propelled you forward with purpose and passion, flickers dangerously low. In the silence of your exhaustion, a harsh voice whispers accusations. You're just not trying hard enough. But what if this isn't laziness at all? What if this depletion isn't a character flaw, but a warning signal, your body and spirit attempting to communicate what you've been too busy to hear? The line between burnout and laziness exists in the same shadowy territory where self-compassion meets self-accountability, where the modern hustle culture collides with our ancient need for rest and meaning. If this video resonates with you, I'd be grateful if you'd consider subscribing to join our community of seekers. The most dangerous kind of exhaustion is the one that wears the mask of success. Maya's story might sound familiar to you. After building a career that once filled her with purpose, she found herself hitting snooze 3 times each morning, dragging herself through days that once energized her. Projects that would have sparked excitement now evoked nothing but quiet dread. Her colleagues still saw the capable professional she'd always been, but inside Maya felt increasingly hollow, as if watching herself perform her life rather than living it. This disconnect, this feeling of being on autopilot, represents one of the most telling differences between burnout and ordinary laziness. When you're experiencing burnout, you develop a strange relationship with your own existence. You're simultaneously present and absent. Your body attends meetings, completes tasks, and maintains appearances, but your spirit hovers somewhere else, detached and observing. This emotional disconnection serves as a protective mechanism, a buffer between your fragile inner self and the overwhelming demands that have depleted your resources. Have you noticed yourself nodding mechanically through conversations that once would have engaged you deeply? Do you catch yourself staring blankly at your screen, minutes passing without registering what you're supposed to be doing? These moments of dissociation aren't laziness. They're your mind's desperate attempt to create distance from unsustainable patterns. The authentic self doesn't simply vanish overnight. This detachment develops gradually, almost imperceptible. Perhaps you first noticed it in small moments, when you stopped sharing ideas in meetings, when you began avoiding certain colleagues, when you started counting the hours until you could retreat. The slow creep of burnout often disguises itself so well that by the time you recognize the symptoms, you're already deep within its grip. What makes this particularly painful is that burnout most often strikes those who were once deeply invested. The passion that once fueled your dedication becomes the very thing that burns away. Your care and commitment, qualities to be proud of, transform into vulnerability when directed toward unsustainable expectations or environments that take without replenishing. Look around at your life right now. Where do you feel most disconnected? In which areas do you sense yourself going through motions without presence? This isn't an indictment of your character or work ethic. Rather, it's an invitation to recognize that your autopilot mode may be revealing something important about boundaries you need to establish or changes you need to initiate. The compass of your attention never lies. When you consistently find yourself unable to focus on tasks that once absorbed you completely, your inner wisdom is attempting to communicate. The question becomes not whether you're being lazy, but whether you're being honest with yourself about what your disconnection is trying to tell you. Motivation doesn't simply disappear, it transforms into a message. Remember when your goals felt magnetic, pulling you forward with an energy that made obstacles seem like worthy challenges rather than insurmountable barriers? For those experiencing burnout, this memory becomes increasingly distant, a faded photograph of someone you used to be. Consider Maya again. She didn't suddenly decide to stop caring about her work. The transition happened in such small increments that she hardly noticed until one day, staring at a major project she would once have attacked with enthusiasm, she felt nothing but emptiness. The goals and ambitions that had structured her identity for years now seemed strangely irrelevant, as though they belonged to someone else entirely. This loss of motivation represents another crucial distinction between burnout and laziness. Laziness typically involves temporary reluctance towards specific tasks. You might procrastinate on filing taxes or cleaning the garage, but you maintain your overall sense of direction and purpose. Burnout, by contrast, undermines your fundamental relationship with achievement itself. The drive that once defined you doesn't merely diminish, it transforms into its opposite, leaving you questioning the very pursuits that once gave your life meaning. What makes this shift particularly disorienting is that it contradicts how you've always understood yourself. If you've built an identity around being reliable, productive, and committed, the inability to summon motivation feels not just frustrating, but existentially threatening. Who are you if not the person who accomplishes, achieves, and delivers? This question reveals the deeper current running beneath burnout, a crisis of meaning. When pursuit of goals no longer resonates with your authentic self, motivation naturally wanes. Your spirit, in its wisdom, withdraws energy from paths that no longer serve your growth or well-being. What appears as lack of motivation might actually be a necessary redirect, your inner compass attempting to steer you toward more sustainable waters. The pressure to maintain unwavering motivation, regardless of circumstances, reflects our culture's uncomfortable relationship with natural cycles of energy and rest. We've been conditioned to view consistent productivity as a moral virtue rather than one aspect of a balanced life. This conditioning makes it difficult to distinguish between legitimate need for recovery and what we've been taught to label as laziness. Take a moment to reflect on your relationship with your goals. When did you last feel genuine excitement about your direction? Can you pinpoint when achievement began feeling more like obligation than inspiration? The answers may reveal not character flaws, but important information about alignment between your current path and your deeper values. The rekindling of motivation rarely comes through self-criticism or force. Instead, it emerges naturally when you create space to reconnect with what genuinely matters to you. Your extinguished flame may not indicate laziness at all, but rather an invitation to discover what truly deserves your precious life energy now. When passion becomes poison, the body's wisdom speaks through aversion. Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of burnout is watching activities you once loved transform into sources of dread. Imagine a musician who once lost track of time while playing, who now can barely bring herself to open the case holding her instrument. Or consider the teacher whose eyes once lit up discussing literature with students, who now mechanically assigns readings and counts the minutes until class ends. For Maya, photography had been more than a hobby. It had been a sanctuary, a creative outlet that balanced the analytical demands of her professional life. Yet as burnout tightened its grip, she found her camera gathering dust. On the rare occasions she forced herself to take pictures, the experience felt hollow, even resentful. What had once been a source of joy had become yet another obligation to fulfill, another performance to maintain. This transformation, from passion to burden, strikes at the heart of your relationship with joy itself. Activities that once replenished your spirit now deplete what little energy remains. The resentment that emerges isn't directed solely at the activity but often at yourself for no longer being able to access the pleasure it once provided. Unlike simple laziness, which might involve temporary reluctance toward effort, burnout creates a deeper aversion connected to emotional exhaustion. The activities themselves haven't changed, but your capacity to experience them has been fundamentally altered. Your emotional resources have been so thoroughly depleted that even experiences designed for restoration now register as demands. This loss extends beyond specific activities to color your entire relationship with pleasure and engagement. You might find yourself going through the motions of socializing while feeling increasingly disconnected from others. You might scroll mindlessly through entertainment options, unable to summon interest in anything. This anhedonia, this inability to experience pleasure, represents not a character failing, but a symptom of a system in distress. What makes this particularly difficult to recognize is that our culture often valorizes sacrifice of pleasure in service of productivity. We've been taught to view discomfort as virtue, to wear exhaustion as a badge of honor. This conditioning makes it challenging to distinguish between necessary discipline and harmful self-depletion. When you've internalized the belief that pushing through discomfort always represents strength, recognizing when your body and spirit require restoration becomes nearly impossible. The path back to joy rarely involves forcing yourself to perform enjoyment you don't feel. Instead, it begins with honest acknowledgement of your current experience. What activities once loved now feel empty or burdensome? When did this shift begin? What circumstances surrounded this change? The answers provide valuable information about which areas of your life may be most depleted and in need of attention. Consider this: your aversion to once beloved activities may represent not laziness but intelligence, your system's way of conserving limited resources and protecting you from further depletion. Rather than judging this response, what might happen if you approached it with curiosity and compassion, as data rather than deficiency? When the vessel overflows, it's not because water has changed its nature, but because capacity has reached its limit. The shifts in emotional landscape that accompany burnout often prove the most confusing and distressing. Maya, who had always prided herself on professionalism, and emotional regulation, found herself snapping at colleagues over minor issues. Tears would appear unexpectedly during commutes or meetings. Small disappointments that once would have rolled off her back now triggered disproportionate reactions that left her feeling unstable and ashamed. This emotional dysregulation represents another crucial distinction between burnout and laziness. When you're experiencing burnout, your emotional resources become severely depleted, leaving you without the usual buffers that help process and integrate day-to-day stresses. Like a computer running too many programs simultaneously, your system becomes overwhelmed, resulting in crashes that seem to come from nowhere. The irritability that often accompanies burnout stems from operating with a depleted nervous system. Every request, no matter how reasonable, registers as one more weight, added to an already unbearable load. The patience and perspective that once allowed you to respond thoughtfully evaporate, leaving rawness in their place. You find yourself reacting rather than responding, driven by survival mechanisms rather than your deeper values. What makes this pattern particularly painful is the shame that often accompanies it. You know these emotional responses don't align with who you understand yourself to be. Each outburst or meltdown reinforces the growing sense that you're losing control, that something fundamental within you is breaking down. The gap between how you're behaving and how you believe you should behave widens, creating additional stress that further depletes your resources. Unlike laziness, which typically involves consistent reluctance toward effort, emotional burnout creates unpredictable swings between numbness and hypersensitivity. You might feel nothing in response to significant events, then find yourself overwhelmed by seemingly minor triggers. This inconsistency reflects a system struggling to regulate itself with insufficient resources. Our culture's uncomfortable relationship with emotion compounds this difficulty. We've been taught to view emotional control as strength and emotional expression as weakness. This conditioning makes it challenging to recognize emotional dysregulation as a legitimate symptom rather than a character failing. When you've internalized the belief that you should always maintain composure regardless of circumstances, acknowledging emotional limits becomes nearly impossible. Take a moment to reflect on your recent emotional patterns. Have you noticed yourself reacting in ways that feel disproportionate or out of character? Do you find your emotional responses increasingly difficult to predict or regulate? These changes may indicate not personal weakness, but a system in distress, your body and spirit, attempting to communicate through the language of emotion what you've been unable or unwilling to acknowledge through other channels. The healing of emotional burnout rarely comes through greater self-control. Instead, it begins with recognition that your emotional responses, however uncomfortable, contain valuable information about boundaries you need to establish or needs currently going unmet. What would happen if you approached your emotional storms not as failures to overcome, but as messengers to be heard? Self-care isn't selfishness, it's stewardship of the only vessel you've been given for this journey. When burnout reaches its advanced stages, it often manifests in physical neglect that becomes impossible to ignore. Maya found herself skipping meals, then forgetting whether she'd eaten at all. Her sleep grew increasingly fragmented, yet she felt too exhausted to address the insomnia. Basic routines like showering or changing clothes began requiring effort that sometimes felt beyond her capacity. The friends she once cherished reaching out began receiving responses that grew increasingly delayed until, eventually, some stopped reaching out altogether. This neglect of fundamental needs represents perhaps the most visible distinction between burnout and ordinary laziness. Laziness typically involves avoidance of specific efforts while maintaining basic self-care. Burnout, by contrast, undermines your fundamental relationship with your own needs. The energy required for even the most basic maintenance of physical and social well-being becomes scarce, leading to a spiral of depletion that compounds itself. What makes this aspect of burnout particularly insidious is that it generates shame that further isolates you when connection and support are most needed. Each abandoned routine, each declined invitation, each night of disturbed sleep reinforces the growing sense that you're failing at the most basic aspects of adult functioning. The gap between how you're living and how you believe you should be living widens, creating additional stress that further depletes already insufficient resources. Our culture's glorification of self-sacrifice compounds this difficulty. We've been taught to view basic needs as luxuries that can be indefinitely postponed, in service of productivity. This conditioning makes it challenging to recognize self-neglect as a symptom rather than a choice. When you've internalized the belief that rest, nourishment, and connection should always be secondary to achievement, acknowledging these needs becomes nearly impossible. The body, however, maintains its own wisdom. When conscious attention to needs fails, the body eventually forces awareness through increasingly dramatic symptoms. What might have been addressed through rest becomes illness. What might have been addressed through boundaries becomes collapse. The neglect isn't sustainable, and eventually the system enforces limitations that have been ignored. Take a moment to conduct an honest inventory of your current self-care. Has your sleep quality deteriorated? Have your eating patterns become irregular or nutritionally depleted? Have you withdrawn from relationships that once provided support and joy? These changes may indicate not laziness or self-indulgence, but legitimate depletion. Your system attempting to communicate through behavior what you've been unable to acknowledge through other channels. The restoration of self-care rarely comes through harsh discipline or ambitious resolutions. Instead, it begins with small, consistent acts of self-compassion. What single aspect of self-care feels most accessible right now? What one small ritual might you restore today? The path back to wholeness often begins not with transformation, but with tender attention to the most basic needs you've been denied. Where in your body do you feel the weight of your exhaustion most heavily? Is it in your shoulders, your chest, the space behind your eyes? What would this sensation say if it could speak to you directly? When did you first notice the subtle shift from enthusiasm to obligation in your work or relationships? Can you identify specific circumstances or patterns that coincided with this change? What activities or environments still provide genuine moments of presence and peace, however brief? What might these oases reveal about what your spirit truly needs right now? If you removed all external expectations and judgments, what would authentic rest look like for you at this moment in your life? What assumptions about productivity and worth might you need to question to allow yourself this restoration? What small boundary, perhaps so modest it seems insignificant, might you establish today to begin protecting your depleted resources? What first step toward replenishment feels genuinely possible, not merely aspirational? The journey from burnout to restoration isn't linear. It involves cycles of awareness, boundary setting, rest, and gradual rebuilding. What matters isn't perfect implementation of self-care strategies, but developing a new relationship with your own limitations. One based in compassion rather than judgment, in listening rather than forcing. The distinction between burnout and laziness ultimately rests not in external behaviors, but in the relationship between your actions and your authentic self. Burnout represents not moral failing, but system failure, a legitimate response to unsustainable demands or misalignment with deeper values. Recognizing these symptoms as messengers rather than opponents creates space for the wisdom they contain. If you're currently navigating this terrain, know that the very awareness you're developing represents the first step toward healing. The capacity to name what you're experiencing, to distinguish between cultural narratives about productivity and your own embodied truth, contains profound power. This recognition doesn't immediately restore what's been depleted, but it creates the conditions where restoration becomes possible. Remember that the culture that glorifies burnout will rarely validate your need for recovery. The permission to rest and rebuild must come from within, reinforced by communities that recognize the cyclical nature of human energy and the legitimacy of human limits. Finding these communities, whether in person or online, represents a crucial aspect of sustainable healing. If this exploration has resonated with you, I invite you to share it with others who might benefit from permission to name their own experience. The conversations that emerge from shared recognition often provide the validation we cannot give ourselves. Your story, whether shared in comments or private reflection, contributes to a necessary counter-narrative about productivity, worth, and the legitimate needs of the human spirit. See you next time. Keep your eyes open, your mind curious, and your spirit evolving.